So Dennis, we're here today to talk about New York's leading Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, a subject that's near and dear to your heart, certainly. And the act really is a nation leading in terms of its aggressiveness and how it's imposing by statute on the state of New York some very aggressive goals to address climate change and decarbonization of our economy and our life in New York. There's a lot of other states are doing similar things, but New York's is somewhat unique in the sense that it's a law. It isn't a guidance, it isn't a suggestion, it isn't a loose, to be attained opportunity. It's hard and fast in the statute, and it's coming up quickly, both in terms of how deep the cuts will be in emissions and how significant renewable energy will be in our economy, but also the time frame in which that has to happen. What are your views on that?
No, I agree, and I think the schedule is what changes the game. We're talking 70% renewable energy mix by 2030, 100% renewable energy mix, zero emissions by 2040. This means that we are rebuilding the entire generation structure or supply structure of the electric system to move from a gas economy to an electric economy.
And that's a huge change, particularly in upstate New York, where it really has been a huge transformation that's on the edge here.
It's a huge transformation, but ideally, if we look at it, it's pretty similar to the way other countries and other states have formatted their solutions to climate, where we focus predominantly at the beginning on the supply side of the electric system. Now, on the supply side of the electric system in New York, that contributes about 15% to our greenhouse gas emissions. It's when we evolve to the demand side of the electric system that the challenges will start to increase, but along with those challenges, the opportunities.
It's interesting, and at one level, the Climate Leadership Act has been a very public process. People are aware of it, but seemingly a lot of businesses, a lot of people just really don't understand what it's going to mean for them and have been sort of on the sidelines as the whole rollout process has been underway. Why do you think that is?
I think that's the case because we sort of rely on the states, the federal government, the regulatory agencies, the electric and gas utilities to dictate how energy policy evolves over a period of time. So we're almost like waiting for these type of programs to be evolved so that we can then react to them. In most cases, most reactions, if it's a commercial or industrial or even a residential consumer, most of those reactions will not occur until their bill increases as a result of energy policy. So it's almost like we're waiting. And if you look at a time schedule as aggressive as the CLCPA, when we start installing or we put in queues all these renewable energy sources, whether it be wind or solar, these are long duration queues. It does not hit a consumer's bill until those generation sources are actually brought online, and that's how the utilities recover that type of cost expenditure, those capital improvements, those capital upgrades, changes in our generation system, and then pass them on to our ratepayers.
So if I'm a manufacturer or have a large commercial operation, I really should be engaged now.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not a time to be a spectator. This is a time to be an active participant. I know that it's not exciting to look at the regulatory process, to look at legislation, but in reality, you're looking at the impact on yourself, and you need to start engaging. Why? Because I think it's the biggest opportunity I've ever seen in my entire life. If we look at energy, not just from a piece of equipment like a solar farm, a wind farm, a battery storage system, a heat pump, et cetera, but what if I look at it in the context of, do I see myself? Can I repurpose my manufacturing process so I'm actually participating in climate change, not just to achieve New York's goals, but to impact the global climate market, which is a significant market, almost like 10 to 15 trillion dollars, depending on who you reference.
So kind of an old school look at this would be, oh my good God, this is just going to cost me a fortune. My electric costs are going to go up. My costs to operate in New York are going to go through the roof. But you're suggesting that there is opportunity there as well. How would you look at that?
Don't get me wrong, there are going to be costs. This is going to be a costly endeavor. But instead of thinking about this from the framework of a ratepayer or taxpayer as a cost center, what if we start thinking about it as we evolve this Climate Act and the scoping document within the Climate Act? We start thinking about individuals as investors and looking at what's the return. So we have some aggressive goals even on the impact on disadvantaged communities, which is a defined community within the structure of the Climate Act. What if we start to focus on them and looking at the potential impact that the climate would have on them? You have to take a step back. What's their biggest challenge? Their biggest challenge actually is infrastructure. There is a lack of transmission and distribution, as well as electric capacity within these communities. So if we're trying to revitalize as part of the Climate Act, we have to go to block and tackle and think about how do we actually utilize the Climate Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bills that are out there, and really think about revitalizing these communities. Because if we don't fix and focus on the infrastructure, not only can we not revitalize, we cannot decarbonize.
So I know one of the focus points of the Climate Act is on distressed communities. And in fact, the Act mandates that a certain percentage of the benefit, however we might define that, go to those communities. How do you see that sort of playing out with commercial or industrial clients of ours?
The concern that we'll have is, will we ask our commercial and industrial customers, consumers of energy, to subsidize turning around or revitalizing these communities based on a defined benefit that was done by others? Are they participating? If the commercial industrial base was part of this conversation, what they would look at is, how do we look at this from the framework of workforce development? That's a direct benefit to the commercial and industrial sector, because one of the biggest challenges that we have is workforce. So if we don't just look at the Climate Act from the perspective of energy, look at it from the perspective of economic development and workforce development, and then we start to see that, oh, we could have a return as part of this process, and it's not just a cost, it could actually be an investment.
Interesting. So if I'm a general counsel and my CEO is coming to me and saying, I've read bits and pieces about this Climate Leadership Act in New York, and I want you, my general counsel, to kind of tell me what we need to do to position ourselves, both to mitigate increased costs and any downside to it, but help me identify opportunities. What would you tell me?
What I tell you is that there are opportunities, not just from a technology point of view, but more from a system response perspective. What happens traditionally when we perform an energy policy, we rely on other agencies, whether they're state or federal, to develop programs and incentives. Those programs and incentives tend to be technology-based. So what we do, if you fit into that funding stream, great, but what if you don't? Does that mean that you can't reduce your impact on emissions? Does that mean that you're out of the running? So part of this is to your previous thought, is how do I get those individuals part of the regulatory process, part of looking at the types of programs and incentives that actually are more market-based than policy-based. Because if it's market-based, you're really responding to the needs of the market. So basically it almost tends to stand on its own 2 feet.
And it's more sustainable, right?
And it's much more sustainable. The idea of balancing economic and environmental sustainability is key in all of these conversations. Separated, it will fail. And I will guarantee you it will fail because it can't sustain itself without continually going to the commercial, industrial, and residential sectors for additional monies for subsidies and incentives. If it's market-based, it's filling a need, and that means there's a value to it.
So Dennis, in your role as a member of the Climate Action Council, which is the group that's been empowered to figure out how to implement this Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, what are some of the key inputs that the council is seeing in terms of actual implementation plan for the act?
Well, David, as you know, I'm one member of a 22-member Climate Action Council that is focused on developing the scoping plan to implement the CLCPA goals. The conversations that we're having have to do with a gas system transition, really thinking about how do we move from a natural gas economy to an electric economy. The reality is we need to start pushing back a little bit and saying that it can't just be a gas transition approach. We have to understand that there needs to be an electric transition as well. For the most part, the electric system, especially at the distribution level, is not prepared to decarbonize. The systems tend to be older. The systems tend to be congested or lack the capacity in order to electrify the local economy. As I stated earlier, when we're focused on the supply side at the outset, we're talking about the transmission system. The challenges on the transmission systems have been siting, so the state created a whole new group for siting. What we then run into is we develop a queue of projects, a very long, extended queue of projects. Now, which ones will go forward, which ones will be canceled, and how is that determined? Well, that puts pressure on now the electric utilities. So the electric utilities are responding in such a way to look at, well, you know, our transmission system in certain areas has capacity. Part of our infrastructure planning process that we're putting out there will increase capacity in certain areas. But wouldn't it be interesting, and as they're evolving, they share that with the marketplace, so we start determining what it is that we're actually going to be able to do in a cost-effective manner.
So you're kind of looking at a prioritization system.
You have, the Climate Action Council has the luxury, and I say luxury to be almost, you know, cynical in some way, of doing this for the previous 3 years. So we've gathered an awful lot of information, and the beauty of the Climate Action Council is it's a very diverse group. So it's all the state agencies, there's environmentalists, activists, et cetera. There's individuals representing generation and even the natural gas industry. We need to start evolving to what is the impact of the electrification process. Like we're doing on the supply side with transmission, we now have to shift our focus to the distribution side of the electric system as we decarbonize. It's one thing to put dates out there. It's one thing to be incredibly aggressive in setting goals, but you can't lose sight of the fundamentals, because it's the fundamentals that'll bring opportunity to the disadvantaged communities. It is the fundamentals that will allow us to do what our plans are wishing that we do in a timely manner. It is those fundamentals that'll make the difference between something being cost effective or not.